Jung's most unsettling discovery had nothing to do with people who lost control in fits of rage. What disturbed him most were the individuals who never seemed to lose control at all. These were not the detached monks or ascetics who deliberately withdrew from the world. They were ordinary people who carried on with business, family, and daily life, yet remained curiously untouched by insult, criticism, or provocation. They could be mocked, challenged, even betrayed, and still their composure seemed unshaken. In his private notes, Jung described this condition as a kind of emotional impermeability. Not numbness, not repression, but a state where the turbulence of other people's emotions simply failed to penetrate. It was as though their psychological skin had become so resilient that nothing outside could bruise it. The disturbing part, at least for Jung, was that this state did not come from denial or coldness. It arose from a psychological transformation that seemed to rewrite the very rules of how human beings process experience. The clearest illustration of this strange condition arrived in Jung's consulting room in 1919, shortly after the First World War. A wealthy German industrialist, let us call him Heinrich, came to Jung at the insistence of his wife. She did not complain that her husband was cruel or neglectful, nor that he suffered depression or anxiety. Her complaint was stranger. Nothing upset him. She described to Jung how she had confessed an affair of 6 months, expecting tears or rage or at least wounded pride. Instead, Heinrich asked her 3 calm questions. Was she happy? Did she require anything from him to feel secure? And did she wish to continue their marriage or end it? She told Jung, "Doctor, he never gets angry. I think something in him is broken." To others, Heinrich appeared unnerving rather than cruel. His employees feared him not because he shouted or punished, but because their attacks, excuses, or complaints never seemed to land. Criticism did not rattle him. Betrayal did not enrage him. Even deliberate insults seemed to drift past him like smoke. He did not laugh them off or suppress them with clenched teeth. He simply appeared unaffected. When Jung began to explore Heinrich's inner world, what he found startled him. This man was not indifferent. He felt the weight of his wife's confession. He recognized the sting of betrayal in business. He was fully aware of others' attempts to provoke him, but he processed these events through a different lens. Instead of treating every slight as an attack, he treated each one as a mirror. This is where Jung introduced the notion of the shadow mirror. In his view, every person who triggers us is revealing something about our own hidden self. The coworker whose arrogance makes us bristle may be reflecting a pride in ourselves that we have disowned. The unreliable friend who never arrives on time may be showing us our craving for control. The relative whose criticism cuts deeply may be exposing our own self-doubt. To Jung, the emotions that flare up in reaction to others are rarely about them. They are messages about us. Heinrich had come to this realization after a devastating betrayal years earlier, when his most trusted business partner stole a client and nearly destroyed his company. Rather than seeking revenge, Heinrich turned inward and asked himself a difficult question: what in this man is a reflection of me? He discovered that his partner's greed mirrored his own hidden fear of scarcity. His dishonesty mirrored Heinrich's tendency to conceal his true emotions. His betrayal revealed Heinrich's own capacity for ruthless self-interest. By confronting these shadows instead of projecting them outward, Heinrich found himself free of the triggers that ensnared others. It was this freedom that unsettled Jung. He had always assumed that anger followed insult as night follows day, that human beings were creatures of automatic reaction. Yet here was a man who had torn open a space between provocation and response, a space wide enough to examine the event, consider its meaning, and choose how to act. Heinrich himself described this strange phenomenon in a way that lingered in Jung's notes. "When someone insults me," he said, "I see their words approaching like arrows in the air. Time slows down, the arrows hover before me, and I realize I have a choice. Shall I let them pierce me, or shall I let them fall harmlessly to the ground?" Jung began to call this space the reaction gap. For most people, stimulus and reaction appear fused together, inseparable. We are cut off in traffic and anger surges before we are even aware of it. A colleague interrupts us and irritation leaps forward before thought. But those like Heinrich seem to insert consciousness into this sequence. They experienced the insult, but rather than being carried away by the rush of reaction, they held it at arm's length, studied it, and then decided what response, if any, was worth giving. From this perspective, Heinrich's calm was not the product of suppression or stoic endurance. It was authorship. He was not a victim of his emotions, but the author of his responses. Over time, Jung noticed that people who achieved this kind of emotional immunity seemed to construct invisible boundaries around themselves. These were not walls that shut out others completely, but filters that decided what could enter the inner world and what could remain outside. Jung described three main forms of these psychological boundaries. The first was what he called a relevance filter. People like Heinrich did not treat every opinion, insult, or comment as equally worthy of attention. Instead, they evaluated whether the information contributed to their growth or their goals. If it did, they examined it carefully. If it did not, they acknowledged it but refused to internalize it. The second boundary was what Jung called ownership. Those with emotional impermeability could distinguish between their feelings and the feelings of others. When someone shouted in anger, they recognized that anger as belonging to the other, not as something they were obliged to absorb. This separation prevented them from carrying the moods of others as though they were their own. The third boundary was the identity core. This was a deep, almost unshakable sense of self. Criticism could still be heard, but it did not rattle the foundation of who they were. They could adjust behavior without feeling as though their worth as a person was under attack. Together, these boundaries created what Jung began to call a fortress of the psyche. But there was a paradox. People who cultivated such inner fortresses often found themselves magnets for those who lacked them. Just as a steady flame draws insects, calm individuals attracted the unstable, the dramatic, and the emotionally volatile. Their calm disturbed others precisely because it deprived them of the emotional exchanges on which they unconsciously relied. Heinrich himself noticed this. He told Jung, "Doctor, the calmer I become, the more people seem desperate to rattle me. It is as though my silence provokes them more than my anger ever could." Or Jung realized that many people regulate their emotions by drawing reactions out of others. A partner may provoke anger to confirm intimacy. A rival may spark conflict to discharge insecurity. When confronted with someone who refuses to play this game, the unsettled are forced to face their own turmoil without external relief. This is why Heinrich's presence was so unnerving to others. His composure exposed their dependence on emotional contagion. What fascinated Jung further was Heinrich's ability to reverse projections. When others accused him of cruelty, greed, or arrogance, he did not deny or defend. Instead, he asked what these accusations revealed about the accuser. "If a man calls me heartless," Heinrich explained, "I hear his own fear of being seen as uncaring. If he obsesses over my profit, I see his anxiety about money. If he accuses me of dishonesty, I sense his own guilt." Jung called this projection reversal. It was as though Heinrich could look straight through the words hurled at him and see the wound behind them. Every insult, he believed, was more diagnostic of the speaker than the target. For Jung, this discovery was disturbing because it suggested that most conflict is built not on reality, but on projection. People rarely fight one another directly. Instead, they battle images of their own unresolved issues, projected outward. If Heinrich was correct, then every criticism we hear tells us more about the critic's inner struggle than about our own character. This inversion stripped attacks of their sting. Once Heinrich recognized that a rival's insult was a confession in disguise. How could he take offense? He saw the frightened child beneath the aggressive adult, and compassion displaced anger. Jung began to suspect that Heinrich was practicing a kind of emotional alchemy, converting potential pain into insight. While most people avoided those who triggered them, Heinrich welcomed them as teachers. Every provocation became a lesson. Every insult became raw material for self-knowledge. He described it simply: when someone disturbs me, I ask what weakness in myself is being exposed. I ask what strength I can build from it. In this way, Heinrich transformed not only his emotional life, but his growth trajectory. Where others saw enemies, he saw unwitting allies in his psychological development. Where others lost energy in anger, he harvested insight and built strength. This was what disturbed Jung most deeply. He realized that individuals like Heinrich could not be manipulated by flattery, crushed by criticism, or controlled by emotional pressure. They were, in a sense, invulnerable, not because nothing touched them, but because everything that touched them was turned into fuel for growth. As Jung continued his conversations with Heinrich, he began to realize how radical this mode of being truly was. Human life, as he had always understood it, was driven by chains of stimulus and reaction: our tempers, our affections, our fears. These seemed like storms that swept us up whether we wished it or not. But Heinrich described a different landscape of the mind, one where storms could be observed from a distance rather than entered blindly. It would have been easy to dismiss Heinrich as an outlier, a man with a peculiar temperament. But Jung could not ignore the possibility that what he witnessed was not an accident of biology, but the result of inner work. If this was a skill rather than a quirk, then it implied that anyone could, in principle, step outside the prison of automatic reaction. That thought both fascinated and unsettled him. Jung often told his students that the most frightening discoveries are not those that reveal our weakness, but those that expose our potential. Weakness can be accepted with resignation. Potential demands responsibility. If Heinrich's emotional authorship was achievable, then what excuse remained for the rest of us who surrendered to rage and despair so easily? Over months of sessions, Jung drew out the steps Heinrich had taken, hoping to understand the architecture of his unusual immunity. The first step, Heinrich explained, was radical self-observation. Most people, he said, live as though their emotions are weather. A storm of anger comes, then passes, leaving them drenched and bewildered. He insisted that the mind can be trained to notice the first drops of rain before the storm fully arrives. When his pulse quickened, when his chest tightened, when thoughts sharpened with irritation, he did not identify with them. He said, "I look at my anger the way I would watch a thundercloud forming on the horizon. It is not me. It is something passing through me." The second step was what he called shadow welcoming. Instead of denying the traits he despised in others, Heinrich turned inward and admitted them as his own possibilities. If he was accused of arrogance, he acknowledged the seeds of arrogance within himself. If he was confronted with greed in another, he asked where greed lurked in his own history. By shining light on these shadows, he robbed them of their power to sneak up on him. The third step was reorientation. When provoked, Heinrich did not ask, "How dare they do this to me?" but What lesson is hidden for me here? In this way, even deliberate cruelty became raw material for growth. He saw enemies as unintentional tutors, each one handing him an uncomfortable but valuable assignment. Jung listened with both admiration and unease. For centuries, moral philosophy had urged forgiveness, patience, and humility. But Heinrich was describing something different. He was not suppressing anger in order to appear virtuous. He was transmuting the energy itself, as if anger were a metal that could be melted down and recast into understanding. This was not morality as duty. It was psychology as alchemy. The implications disturbed Jung because they shattered the excuses most people carried. If Heinrich's method was real, then no one could claim, "He made me angry," or "She ruined my peace." The chains of cause and effect were not as unbreakable as people liked to believe. Responsibility for inner life could not be shifted onto others, and that responsibility, Jung knew, is often the heaviest burden. Still, he could not dismiss what he saw. Heinrich's life gave evidence. His marriage, though shaken by betrayal, continued with surprising stability. His business survived crises that destroyed competitors. Even his health appeared to benefit. He slept soundly, ate modestly, and carried himself with vitality despite the stresses of his position. If emotional storms were diseases of the psyche, Heinrich seemed strangely immune. Yet this immunity was not without cost. Jung noted that Heinrich often felt lonely in his clarity, while others found solidarity in shared anger or indignation. He stood apart. He told Jung, "Sometimes I envy those who can shout together, who can rage side by side. But I cannot go back to that. Once you see the machinery of projection, the illusion no longer holds." This was perhaps the most sobering discovery. Emotional authorship creates distance. The games of provocation, blame, and revenge that dominate ordinary social life lose their grip. And in losing them, one also loses a certain kind of companionship. To live in authorship is to live partly outside the collective spell. Jung wrestled with this paradox. Was Heinrich freer or was he isolated? Was he more human or less? The answer, Jung suspected, depended on perspective. From the standpoint of the herd, Heinrich was an anomaly, difficult to trust, impossible to manipulate. From the standpoint of the individual soul, he was perhaps closer to true independence than most ever achieve. In his later lectures, Jung hinted at this without naming Heinrich. He spoke of the terrifying responsibility that comes with individuation, the process of becoming a whole self rather than a fragment of the collective. He warned that those who step onto this path may find themselves alienated from familiar comforts, but he also insisted that the alternative, remaining forever trapped in reflex and projection, was a deeper prison. Looking back, Jung's notes reveal a quiet admiration that he never fully admitted in print. He described Heinrich as a man who has ceased to be ruled by contagion. That phrase captured what he saw. Someone who no longer caught the fevers of anger and fear spreading through groups. Someone who lived according to an inner climate rather than outer weather. The disturbing lesson was not that such people existed, but that their existence proved how much more was possible for the rest of us. If Heinrich could author his responses, then so could we. If he could dissolve the chains of automatic reaction, then those chains were never as solid as they appeared. What remains, then, is the question of how we choose to live. Most of us cling to the belief that others dictate our moods. We say, "She ruined my day," or "He made me furious," as though we are puppets tugged by invisible strings. But Jung's unsettling discovery whispers another possibility, that the strings are not real, that the hands pulling them are our own, and that the moment we claim authorship, the puppet becomes a person. The path Heinrich walked is not glamorous. It requires observation so relentless it can border on uncomfortable. It requires admitting to ourselves the shadows we would rather deny. It demands seeing enemies as unwilling teachers and insults as invitations to grow. But if followed, it promises something rare, freedom from the tyranny of reaction. Perhaps that is why Jung called it disturbing. Freedom is always frightening. It removes excuses, strips away the comfort of blame, and leaves us alone with our choices. Yet it is also the only condition in which true life begins. Near the end of his sessions, Heinrich said something that Jung preserved word for word. It was not a boast or a declaration, but a simple reflection. I am not beyond anger. I am not beyond fear. I have simply learned to ask them what they want to teach me before I decide what to do with them. That sentence, Jung admitted, haunted him for years. It suggested that emotional immunity is not the erasure of feeling, but the transformation of its role. Emotions remain, but they no longer drive the carriage. They ride as passengers, offering directions, but the reins rest firmly in the hands of the self. And perhaps this is the final lesson. To be human is not to be free of storms, but to learn to watch them roll across the sky without being swept away. To stand, like Heinrich, in that quiet gap between stimulus and response, and there to discover the terrifying, liberating truth. We are not victims of our emotions, but authors of them.